Hello and welcome to the Farming Week, the podcast from Agriland keeping you up to date with all the latest in Irish agriculture. I'm Charles O'Donnell and I'm joined this week by Aisling O'Brien. Well, once again, the increasing fuel costs have dominated much of the news cycle this week, with farmers and rural communities very much feeling the effects, especially due to the reliance on cars and the lack of public transport, and that's to say nothing of the cost of green diesel. Well, the government has now indicated that it will bring forward some measures to alleviate the pressure on households. Aisling, we don't know much about what the government is planning to do at this stage, but what do we know at present?
Yes, Charles, we certainly don't need to tell the listeners about the rising fuel prices. It's so evident anytime you pass a filling station at the moment. You can just see the prices of diesel and petrol creeping up day by day as the real impact of the ongoing war in the Middle East is felt. Of course, the Strait of Hormuz, a water body that few of us may have heard about up to recent weeks, has really come into play now. Of course, that body of water responsible for about a fifth of the world's oil being transported through, and the ongoing war having a huge impact on the ground for consumers, as you say, farmers, rural dwellers at the moment. But there may be a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Taoiseach and Minister for Finance Simon Harris told the Dáil late last night that the government is now finalising what he said will be an appropriate intervention for the areas in which there is the most acute pressure and challenges. And the government's response is set to be agreed at the cabinet meeting next week, and the Taoiseach indicated that any intervention would be for a short time. Have a listen to this.
Today, as you'd expect, I've spoken further with the Taoiseach. I've also engaged with relevant ministers and have had further briefings with my own economic team in the Department of Finance. And this evening I want to confirm to this House that we're now finalising what we believe to be an appropriate intervention for the areas in which there is most acute pressure and challenge. The government's response will be formalised and agreed at the next cabinet meeting.
Now, Minister Harris also indicated that the government intervention would not be targeted at the carbon tax, and he said the tax is not the cause of the current spike in energy prices. There has been numerous calls for the government to, postpone the forthcoming carbon tax increase, Charles, in the coming weeks. And obviously the Taoiseach is saying that's not where they're looking at. Perhaps it may be excise duties on petrol and diesel prices. That might be something they could look at. It's something that they did do following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine back in 2022, and we saw for a period of time that there was a cut in excise duties, which then subsequently was reintroduced on a phased basis again. So maybe that is something the government could be looking at the moment. But Taoiseach Simon Harris told the Dáil that where there is evidence of unfair pricing or behaviour that is not consistent with consumer law, it will be investigated and acted upon. And he added that the government is willing to strengthen laws in that area, responding to calls for motorists to look into the spike in the fuel prices that they are seeing at the pumps in recent weeks. Now, Cork Northwest TD Andreas Moynihan, who's also the chair of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Agriculture and Food, welcomed the plans to intervene in the rising cost of fuel, but he has called for targeted measures on the cost of green diesel for farmers. And he said that rising diesel costs are placing unsustainable pressure on farmers. And he said that they're being squeezed from every angle, and fuel costs are now one of the most immediate and unavoidable pressures. He said that green diesel costs are a farming issue now, but they will soon be part of the wider cost of living issue. And he said when diesel prices rise to this extent, that cost doesn't just stay on the farm. It feeds directly into food production and ultimately lands on the shelves in higher prices for consumers. And he said at the current prices of €1.40 to €1.50 per litre, a routine 1,000 litre fill is costing farmers up to €1,500. And for many, that's an upfront cost which they're being forced to absorb with little or no margin to cushion it. And Deputy Moynihan said if this situation continues unchecked, we will be seeing the consequences right across the food chain, from producers to processors and ultimately at the cash register for consumers as well. But he said there is a clear case now for targeted, time-bound interventions to stabilise costs and protect both farmers and consumers. And he said the longer this is left unaddressed, the greater the knock-on impact there will be for everybody. So hopefully, Charles, we will see some indications over the coming days days about what the government is planning. And as soon as we get any indication or update, we'll bring it to you on Agriland.
And Aisling, the issue of fertiliser is taking a bit of a back seat at the moment due to the very sharp increases in fuel costs. But it needs to be remembered that that's by no means any walk in the park in terms of costs either. And that did come up for debate in the Dáil as well this week.
Yes, Charles. So along with fuel, there is a lot of concern out there about how the ongoing war in the Middle East is going to impact on fertiliser prices. And Minister of State at the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, Michael Healy-Rae, was speaking in the Dáil this morning, and he said that the impact on fertiliser price will depend on how long the disruption lasts in the region. And the issue was raised by Labour Party TD Robert O'Donoghue, who asked what assessments the Department of Agriculture had made in relation to the likely consequences for fertiliser prices as a result of the war. Now, in particular, Deputy O'Donoghue said horticultural growers are already under severe cost pressures, and further increases to the price of fertiliser due to the conflict could undermine domestic food production. And he urged the minister to consider the introduction of a horticulture crisis fund, similar to what was introduced back in 2022. Now, Minister Healy-Rae said that the concern about price raising effects of CBAM, which of course is the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which we've spoken about here before on the podcast, that actually led to the Irish fertiliser industry buying significant volumes of products in advance of CBAM coming into full effect on January 1st. And the minister said it's understood that there may be sufficient fertiliser stocks to last until the middle of April. And he said the National Fertiliser Database import figures show that fertiliser stocks increased significantly during the final quarter of last year. And he said that means there are reserves of fertiliser in the country. And he noted that a lot of farmers may have bought fertiliser already, and that a fertiliser price shock may not be as acute as the spring of 2022, which coincided, of course, with the outbreak of war between Russia and Ukraine. And pointing back to that period, Minister Healy-Rae said back in 2022, a pallet of fertiliser was like a pallet of gold because of the massive increase in price at that time. Now, the minister told the Dáil that the government will continue to monitor the situation. Have a listen.
All I will say is that the government, of course, will continuously assess the situation and try to respond in the most proactive and helpful way that we can. But it is too early to assess the full impact of the increased energy and fertiliser costs. But nevertheless, any spike in these prices will obviously have an impact on farmers' margins. The impact on fertiliser price will depend on how long the disruption lasts, whether physical energy production infrastructure is damaged, and how secondary markets will respond.
And that was Minister Michael Healy-Rae speaking there. Well, fertiliser is unfortunately going to be mentioned in our next story as well. The Environmental Protection Agency has said just this afternoon, Thursday, that nitrogen levels in 20 monitoring sites at various locations around the country increased by 10% in 2025, which the EPA said indicates higher nitrogen levels in Irish river waters, with fertiliser getting the blame. Aisling, what exactly has the EPA said here?
Yeah, so this is the latest Early Insights Nitrogen Indicators report from the EPA, as you said, published today. Charles, doesn't make for particularly pleasant reading. It sets out the latest assessment of nitrogen levels in Ireland's major rivers for last year. And that report is showing that nitrogen levels in rivers increased by 10% in 2025. Now, as you said, this report, it's based on data from 20 selected monitoring sites across the country. And based on that data, the EPA found that nitrogen levels in the southeast of the country are too high to support good ecological health in water bodies. And the EPA said the primary source of nitrogen in Irish rivers is agriculture. And it said this is from excess losses of nitrogen in chemical and organic fertilisers. Now, the EPA said that nitrogen levels can fluctuate due to a combination of factors, which include weather patterns, land management, and inputs of nitrogen to the environment as well. But I suppose specifically looking at the last 2 years, 2024 and 2025, the EPA identified a number of key factors which it said had influenced nitrogen concentrations. One of those, Charles, was fertiliser sales, because even though sales don't, I suppose, directly correlate with losses of nitrogen to the environment, the EPA said they are a factor in increases in nitrogen concentration in waters. And they pointed to data from the Department of Agriculture which showed that fertiliser fertiliser nitrogen sales increased by over 10.5% in 2024 compared with the previous year, followed by a further 12.5% increase in 2025. Now, the EPA also noted another factor which comes into play here is weather, and it said that nitrogen concentrations overall in 2025 being higher than 2024 were down to the fact that last year was wetter. And the EPA has published a map looking at the status of various river catchments in terms of nitrogen concentrations around the country. You can take a look at that on our website and app. But definitely, Charles, it doesn't make for a particularly positive reading. I suppose we have obviously the nitrates derogation granted now for the coming years, but all of this data does feed in, to the Commission's decisions in years to come. So it is something that we will, I suppose, be keeping a very close eye on.
Well, issues around nitrates and water quality are often cited in the context of the dairy sector, and water quality is an area where that industry has allocated quite a lot of resources in recent years. And this week saw further action in the area with a new action plan for water quality in one of the key river catchment areas in the country. Aisling, can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so yesterday saw the official launch of the Blackwater Catchment Action Plan, and it's all aiming to improve water quality in that river catchment. And the Blackwater is one of 8 priority catchments which were highlighted by the EPA as a catchment of concern. The agency also highlighted issues in the Boyne, the Slaney, the Barrow, the Nore, the Suir, the Lee and the Bandon Elan rivers. And the EPA said that reducing nutrient and sediment losses will greatly contribute towards water quality improvements in both the long and short term. So this Blackwater Catchment Action Plan, it's part of the wider Teagasc Better Farming for Water campaign. And the programme aims to bring farmers, the industry, local authorities and researchers together to deliver what they say are meaningful science-based actions on the ground. And this plan will seek to encourage the early adoption of the 8 actions for change on farms across all of the catchment, across the Blackwater catchment to improve water quality. Now, dairy farmer Kevin Toomey, he's going to chair up the Blackwater Catchment Implementation Group, and that group is going to oversee and coordinate the new action plan. And Dairygold is going to be the industry lead on this project, and it said it will foster collaboration among stakeholders. Now, the processor did note that its farmer suppliers are already implementing practical measures that reduce nutrient and sediment losses, and they said that this plan will help to accelerate that momentum. Now, in recent months, we should note that similar action plans have also been launched for the Boyne, the Nore, the Suir, the Barrow and the Slaney River catchments as well as part of that wider Teagasc programme. So I suppose it just shows the action and the efforts that are going on in the ground. But I suppose against the report we were just talking about, it'll make those projects all the more important, Charles.
And Aisling, outside of water quality specifically, we did see other new initiatives announced by dairy processors this week. Can you tell us about those?
So first up, Tirlawn has launched a new large-scale knowledge transfer programme, Charles, which they said is aimed at farm productivity, sustainability and long-term resilience. So this initiative is called Farm Elevate, and it's a partnership between Tirlawn and Teagasc. And the co-op said the programme is going to focus on key priority areas such as productivity, animal health, climate action, farm costs and sustainability. And the aim of this programme is to support farmers in adopting best practice and new technologies across their businesses. And there's going to be 7 lighthouse farms is what they're being termed as, I suppose, essentially demonstration farms. And they've been selected for strong farm management practices, we were told, and the findings from those farms will be disseminated out across the supplier base for Tirlawn and the learnings from those farms. And moving to Kerry Dairy Ireland now, they launched a farmer support programme this week which focuses on supporting the mental health and well-being of farm families. Now, Kerry Dairy Ireland said it's the first dairy processor in the country to extend this full employee assistance programme to its suppliers and their families. The programme is going to offer 24/7 confidential counselling, well-being support and guidance at no cost to farm families. And the processor said that farmers will have access to counselling, mental mental health support, financial and legal advice, parenting and family guidance, and crisis assistance through phone, app or online. So a good initiative there rolled out. And speaking of dairy processors, Charles, we did have further milk price announcements for February supplies over the past week. Tyrlawn, Lakeland Dairies, Dairygold and Kerry Dairy Ireland all decided to leave prices unchanged from January, and further details of all of those prices available on Agriland. And staying with dairy markets, the global dairy trade index recorded a slight increase this week to continue its overall upward trend that we've seen since the beginning of 2026. And following the latest trading event, which took place on Tuesday, the index climbed up by just 0.1%, but it's a win and we'll take it, Charles. It continues that positive growth. And I suppose it should be noted, it is a notably smaller rise than the recent increases that we have been seeing following auctions since January 6th. And one of the owners of the GDT, Fonterra, had a major announcement this week. The co-op announced that Chief Executive Miles Hurrell has resigned. The Fonterra chair, Peter McBride, said that after a 25-year career with Fonterra, including 8 years as CEO, Hurrell has decided that the time is right for him to leave the co-op, and the board have thanked him for what they called his courageous leadership. Now, Miles Hurrell said that it had been an incredible privilege to have a long career with Fonterra. He has a 6-month notice period, Charles, and the co-op said this will enable an organised leadership transition. And they said they are confident they can run a robust selection process and appoint a new CEO in the coming months. And of course, all of that announcement comes after all the required regulatory approvals were recently received for the sale of Fonterra's global consumer and associated business for 4.2 billion New Zealand dollars, which will result in a payout to farmer shareholders as well. More details, of course, on Agriland on all of that transaction as well. So much change in the Southern Hemisphere this week.
Moving over to the beef side of things, and figures from the main statistics body of the European Union is predicting a sharp decrease in beef production in Ireland. Aisling, what did these figures tell us?
Yeah, so this is Eurostat's new 2026 livestock production trends report. And that is suggesting that the production of most types of livestock across Europe will decline this year. Now, the report said that France is going to be the largest producer of beef in the EU in the second half of this year. Eurostat expects France to account for just over 23% of the EU's total beef production in the period. Unfortunately for us, Ireland is set to see a 5% decline in production, according to this report, to around 900,000 head. And there's likely to be a small fall in production in Germany as well to 1.7 million head. Spain, though, according to the report, it's the only key beef producer in Europe that is expected to increase beef potentially up to 2.7% to bring it to 1.1 million head there. Now, Eurostat forecasts that in the second half of the year, beef production levels will fall to 11.4 million head in the EU, and this would be 500,000 head less than the same period in 2025, which is a drop of 4.2%. And the report does note as well that sheep production could fall by up to 18% to 12.2 million head between the second half of 2025 and the second half of this year. But the report says there's a slightly brighter outlook for pig production in the EU, which could increase to 61.2 million head in the last quarter of this year, which would be an increase of 3.2% on the same period last year.
Separately, Aisling, a leading buyer of Irish calves has warned that the current prices being paid for calves is not adding up. So what does Seamus Gallen say here, Aisling?
Yeah, so a lot of discussion in recent weeks about the price of cattle. I suppose something that we did see last year, those strong prices, but particularly now in recent weeks, the prices being paid for calves are making the headlines right across the country from March. So this week, our technical beef specialist, Breffney O'Brien, caught up with Seamus Scallon, and he founded the Wicklow Calf Company. He's one of the country's leading calf buyers, as you said. And Charles, his assessment that the current prices being paid for calves is, in his words, not adding up. up. And he noted that factory beef price offers are in decline, and he said that he believes the Irish base price for beef is heading towards $6.50 a kilo. Now, Scallon said that in some cases, farmers killing cattle at the factory at the moment are losing between €300 and €400 a head. And he said when you look at what's happening in the current trade, things are just not adding up. He said that calf prices are up €200 to €300 a head from peak last year, but calf exports are down. He said that they can't sell the Irish calves in mainland Europe at the price that they're making. And Scallon said that he believes the farmers buying calves in the past 6 to 8 weeks have been making a mistake, in his opinion. And he advised farmers buying calves to do their sums. And he said that farmers buying calves at the current high prices need to come back to reality, in his view. And if you want to read more about Seamus's views on the entire calf trade at the moment, you can check out that interview in full on our website and app. But definitely some strong words there on the current situation in the Mart rings when it comes to calves.
We'll move on now, and the progress on developing Ireland's nature restoration plan under the controversial nature restoration law is picking up pace. A set of recommendations on the plan have now been submitted to Minister of State for Nature, Christopher O'Sullivan. Aisling, do we know what the Minister has been told?
Yeah, so Charles, Ireland, as you said, we're currently developing a national nature restoration plan, which of course is due to the EU nature restoration law, which was adopted in August of 2024. And that law sets binding targets for EU member states for habitats, pollinators, forests and urban green spaces to combat climate change and biodiversity loss. So this week, the final report from the Independent Advisory Committee on Nature Restoration was presented to Minister Christopher O'Sullivan. And it has, as you said, a set of recommendations for the government to inform the development of our nature restoration plan in this country. Now, the document was developed over the past 15 months by the committee, which includes representatives from a range of sectors, including farm organisations. And along with hearing from various experts, this committee also held various public engagements, and it included one which was dedicated especially to farming. There was over 1,000 people involved in the various different public engagements that the committee held. And there was also in-person and online community events which allowed people to provide feedback and views to the committee as well. Now, Dr. Evie Ní-Thuilleabháin is the chair of the Independent Advisory Committee on Nature Restoration, and she told Agriland today that one of the main priority recommendations for the government is to provide an additional pot of money that should be set aside for the new obligations that the state has under the nature restoration law. She said this would be to ensure that the Common Agricultural Policy isn't being asked to also incorporate all of these new obligations of the nature restoration regulation, and essentially safeguarding CAP for what CAP is meant to be, and looking to the government to find the money elsewhere. She said then that this new pot of money, this nature fund, would be put towards supporting farmers, fishermen and foresters to make sure that the work they do in protecting and restoring nature is recognised as the public good that it is. Now, the committee also recommends that the state should lead on meeting nature restoration targets by using public lands. Dr. Ní-Thuilleabháin said this includes national parks, lands owned by the Department of Agriculture, Coillte, Bord na Móna, local authorities and other state bodies as well. And she said that the committee listened very carefully to the concerns raised by farm organisations about the nature restoration law. And she said the report very much puts the farmer's perspective front and centre. And she said there's also an opportunity now to review existing schemes to make sure that they actually work for farmers and that they're easy to access. And she also said it's important to push back against any misinformation that's out there in relation to the nature restoration regulation. And she said that nothing has come into force yet, and she advised farmers to be wary of any scaremongering that might be going on, in her opinion, about the nature restoration law as well. Now, Minister O'Sullivan said this week that he intends to publish the recommendations as soon as possible, and he said that over the coming weeks he's going to be reading through this report in depth. He's going to be engaging with his colleagues right across government and working out the detail of how they can use these recommendations as well.
Finally this week, a young man from Galway has won the 2026 Institute of Professional Auctioneers and Valuers Novice Rostrum Auctioneer competition. Aisling, can you tell us a bit about Joe Gibbons and what he's won here?
Yeah, a huge congratulations to Joe Gibbons, who hails from Ballinasloe in County Galway. He actually works in the office in Ballinasloe Livestock Mart as well. He was one of 7 contestants who took to the rostrum as part of the IPAV Novice Rostrum Auctioneer competition, which was held recently in Tatterstalls in County Meath. And we are told that Joe impressed the judges with his clarity, his pace and command of the auction process. So along with being presented with the Ron Duff Memorial Cup, Joe is now going to travel to America's Auction Academy in Texas, and he's going to undergo intensive auctioneer training. Now, the runners-up in this year's competition were Dara Walsh and Elliot Potterton, and well done to them and to everybody who took part and showed off their skills, because I suppose auctioneering is such a crucial part of our industry, Charles. It's vital, whether it's coming to selling cattle in the mart or selling property. We need young people coming up through the ranks, so it's great to see those young people doing so well in the competition. And hopefully all of those who took part in the competition will have as long a career as veteran auctioneer George Candler, who of course is synonymous with Kilkenny Mart. We caught up with George this week on Agriland to speak about his 54 years on the rostrum and still going strong. And he's actually been the MC at the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Kilkenny over the past few years. But this year, George had the honour of being named as the Grand Marshal and led the parade in Kilkenny. So congratulations to him. A huge week for George, and we hope he enjoyed his day. And of course, well done to everybody who took part in parades across the country this week. We saw all manners of vintage tractors, modern tractors, trailers and bales of hay, everything put to good use, and the farming community out in force, and great colour and great fun across the country in St. Patrick's Day parades. And I hope everybody enjoyed the day this week.
Yeah, absolutely, Aisling. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. Just before we go, we'll just remind you that horticulture growers have until March 31st to complete the Department of Agriculture's horticulture census, with Minister Michael Healy-Rae urging growers to finish and submit the census. But that's where we'll leave it. Please don't forget to rate, review and follow The Farming Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love if you could spare some time to give us 5 stars and share The Farming Week with anyone you think might be interested. From Aisling and myself, all the best for now.